Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, Madagascar, a virtual journey through an evolutionary wonderland, presented by Dr. Court Whelan. Court is NetHab's Director of Sustainability and Conservation Travel and has been guiding trips for us worldwide since 2013. It is such a pleasure to have you with us today, Court. I'm going to hand things off to you.
Thank you, Kendall. As always, greetings, folks, from Boulder, Colorado. We're getting into the Halloween spirit. I'm looking out my window here, and we've got Halloween decorations up and ready to go. There's little ghouls swaying in the breezeway. Yeah, so Madagascar. You know, I get so excited about these presentations. I get to talk about the things I love most in the world. And, you know, this photo I took last year, actually, on one of my most recent expeditions in Madagascar, a little Milne Edward Sifica in the highlands of Rhonda Mafana National Park. A lot of tongue twisters in today's presentation. Captures the glory of Madagascar. It's a surprise. It's a wonderland. It's a paradise. There's extraordinary science behind everything. It's a biological treasure chest. It's one of the top most needed to be protected areas of the world. Let's get right into it. It's simply put, it's wild. Madagascar is an absolute wild place. I say, you know, I often get the question, so my guide, I head over sustainability. I've been in tourism and travel for going on 20 years now. And one of the questions I get asked most is, you know, where's your favorite place in the world? I can never name just one. Usually my stock answer is, well, it's wherever I was most recently. But without a doubt, Madagascar is in my top list because it's, you know, at the end of the day, one of the places when I think about getting back there, when I'm packing my bags or booking my tickets to go there, it gets me the most excited about most places in the world. So without further ado, yeah, let's look at why Madagascar is so wild from a scientific perspective, from a bit of a travel perspective. It is a wild, wild place. It is home to an incredible rate of endemism, and what the word endemic or endemism means is basically stuff not found anywhere else in the world. You've probably heard this term thrown around. Native is a little bit different. Native means it's from there originally, but endemic means it's native and not found anywhere else on the planet. So it's a little bit of like a Galapagos Islands of the Indian Ocean. You'll hear me refer a lot to that comparison of Galapagos, but this evolutionary aspect of things, how long it's been isolated from any other mainland or any other island, makes it so special. Isolated about 10 times as long, which gets us to have you know, extraordinary biodiversity, extraordinary rates of endemism, things not found anywhere else in the world. About 8 out of every 10 things you see in Madagascar, whether it's lizards, whether it's lemurs, there are no lemurs anywhere else in the world. The plant life is the same. It's simply extraordinary. In fact, lemurs, you know, these are often the things that steal the show. Most people think, okay, you know, it's King Julius, it's the ring-tailed lemur, it's the most famous famous lemur of all, but there are actually 107 different species of lemur. So ringtail is just one of 107 different ones. In fact, you can actually look at it in terms of families. This will not be on the test, but you can see here, there are actually 5 major families of lemurs with various species going down each one of these columns. To put it into perspective, you don't need to memorize any of these tongue twisters, but to put in perspective, the feline family, the family that all the world's cats are in, from lions to leopards to jaguars to ocelots to margays to Palos's cats to snow leopards, those are all one family. So it's extraordinary to think that you have this incredible, what we call radiation out from one family into 5 different ones, and the forms and function and looks and diversity is pretty extraordinary. And we'll see quite a few of these in today's presentation. It is also a land of reptiles, much like how Galapagos is a land of reptiles. Incredible speciation. We have even more so in Madagascar. Remember, Madagascar is a pretty massive island. It's actually the 4th largest island in the world. You really have to fly from point to point if you're going to make any sort of reasonable time, because it's huge. It's just a little bit smaller than Borneo as the list goes. So it has about 67 different species of chameleon, more than anywhere else in the world. It is home to the world's largest and smallest chameleon. We'll see pictures of both today. Is home to these incredible things that look like moving tree bark. These are leaf-tailed geckos. Again, just like that list of incredible number of species of lemurs, we have the same thing going on with chameleons, with geckos, birds as well. Now, birds do not have the same rate of endemism because they do fly. There are islands like Mauritius and Comoros and Reunion and various things. The African mainland is just across the Mozambique Channel, but nevertheless, there are extraordinary bird species there, and they are very, very unique. And then get to, you know, my favorite group of all, of course, the insects, token entomologist here. It has, you know, another question I often get once people learn that I have my doctorate degree in entomology is, okay, well, what's your favorite insect in the world? Well, I'd be hard pressed to say it's not the monarch butterfly, just because I've studied it for so long, I've guided down there for so long. If there is a second place, or maybe even tied for first place, it's this little guy right here, the illustrious Giraffe-Necked Weevil. This species endemic only to Madagascar. We'll see more pictures of these guys, and we'll talk more about its life history here in just a few slides. So anytime you have this crazy rate of biodiversity, weird, wacky, wild animals, it's always due to something bigger. It's not just because the animals felt like diversifying and felt like differing genetics. It's because of landscapes. So the landscapes of Madagascar are actually, if there's an umbrella, the different aspects of landscapes gives rise to the extraordinary biodiversity in Madagascar. So within this one island, you have extraordinary differences, from these wild spiny forests in the southwest to these deciduous forests on the coast with this massive aggregation of limestone. You have baobab trees and everything in between. The first couple of places we'll go through today in this journey throughout Madagascar is going to be the rainforest and cloud forest. Could not be more different than the spiny forest or this dry deciduous forest on the coast. And then I think, you know, the reason we are able to go to Madagascar relatively easily these days is because it does actually have some ecotourism infrastructure. It's not as much, nearly as much as mainland Africa. It's not as much as many places in the world, but it does have a somewhat long history of French colonization. Obviously not all good stories come from that, but there is this sort of higher level of service, sophistication, infrastructure, pretty decent roads, small charter flights you can get from point to point, and some pretty great lodges that are not just pretty to look at, but they're really great for the environment, doing some very, very next level things for conservation and protection. We'll talk about that at the very end. Anjajabi Lodge being one of the best in the world. And then interestingly, you know, there's not a ton of exports from Madagascar other than, you know, some tea and coffee and chocolate, kind of traditional things that we talk about in the tropics belt. But it is home to the only agriculturally significant orchid in the world. So it's actually got the largest biodiversity of orchids anywhere in the world, over 1,000 different species. But one in particular is quite important, and that's what this guy is. I can't take any hands from the audience or any guesses, but spoiler alert, this is vanilla, Madagascar vanilla, one of the most important agricultural products, and it is from an orchid. So we've got a lot of really interesting things that exist in Madagascar, but I think one of the equally interesting things is what doesn't exist in Madagascar. So just across the channel, just across Mozambique Channel, we have this huge assemblage of major carnivores, big animals, elephants, giraffes, zebra, lions, leopards, all sorts of stuff, big stuff. They are not found anywhere in Madagascar. They are not even found in the fossil record of Madagascar. There's actually some pretty decent fossils found. Most of the fossils that we find from Madagascar goes all the way back 160 million years to the Jurassic period, T-Rexes and velociraptors. It's one of the biggest hotbeds for fossil activity in that southwest. But that whole evolutionary time between now and that past time period is when the big cats arrived, all the giraffes, elephants, and they're not anywhere to be seen. So this is an interesting part of the story. In fact, the biggest carnivore, the only real predator in the island, top level predator, is what's known as a fossa. And it's kind of like the size of a medium dog. It is arboreal, it's terrestrial, it lives on the ground and in trees. It's really the only thing that presents any sort of real danger to a lot of the bigger critters like lemurs. So as a result, with this lack of predation, largely in the island chain, if you've been to Galapagos, you know that a lot of these animals, when they don't have major predators that they often are looking out for, they don't have a natural fear of things like humans. So as a result, we get this amazing glimpse at wildlife when we're out there, whether we're photographing, whether we're hiking, when animals don't have that normal fear of humans. It's a really special place. Okay, so let's kind of zoom out and get the big picture of things. You know, what's going on with Madagascar? Why do I keep on saying it's so special? What gave rise to this extraordinary biodiversity? And why is it so different from the African continent? Well, okay, so the world is composed of about 15 major plates, okay? And these are tectonic plates. They're underneath the land, they're underneath the oceans, and they're constantly moving, all right? So the analogy I often use is imagine a small swimming pool, okay? And that's the Earth. These plates are different sized rafts and inner tubes, and you have little rubber duckies here that are all just packed in the swimming pool. And as things start to move, any sort of movement, because they're all floating on top of magma, it starts to rotate and push and shape shift everything. And so even if just one little plate is moving, this is a particularly active plate. If you are in California, you know that. It moves the whole world, and it's been doing so for hundreds and hundreds of millions of years. In fact, back in the day, this is probably about 200 million years ago, maybe a little bit more than that, we had a very different picture of the Earth. And I love this map. It took some very bright minds to put actual country divides between where these ancient landmasses were, but this is what the world looked like back when it was relatively contiguous. This is back in the age of the dinosaurs. We're talking about, again, 200 million years ago. And look where Madagascar is. Look where it's situated. We're going to go ahead and zoom in, just take a little look here, and look what it's next to. It's next to Sri Lanka and India and Antarctica and mainland Africa. It's all contiguous with South America. So it actually has its origins, its geologic origins, with a very, very unique, different part of the world. It's kind of amazing to think that if we were to look at fossilization underneath all those glaciers in Antarctica, we'd probably find the same fossils that we see in Madagascar from this period. It's very, very fascinating. Unfortunately, we don't get a real active, able chance to see fossils when we're doing expeditions in Madagascar, because they're all either still buried underneath the soil, or they're very heavily protected. But nevertheless, one thing I love is that, you know, when you look at the range of some of the major dinosaur families and species back in this time, 160 plus million years ago, Madagascar was a corridor. It was a big hotbed for dinosaur activity. So as a result, we have a lot of really interesting geology and a lot of interesting fossilization in Madagascar. So let's kind of talk about what's going on. I keep on mentioning this sort of, it could be, you know, an irrelevant figure to you, 160 million years ago. What does that really mean? Well, I could launch into another hour presentation about the geologic history of Earth, going all the way back to the Precambrian era, you know, 500 million years ago. But let's save that for another time. Let's just simply talk about the origins of Madagascar and its isolation. So back again, about 170 million years ago, this is right in the smack dab middle of the age of dinosaurs. This is the Jurassic. This is when T-Rex is running around and Brontosauruses are going around and Triceratops and whatnot. So we've got Madagascar in the middle of this massive landmass. So there's a lot of life going on. It's also sort of close to the tropics belt. It's warm. It's the Earth is more oxygenated and warmer than usual, so a lot of prolific life. But then it starts breaking up. Again, remember the rafts in the pool. Things are always moving around. There wasn't any sort of big meteor that got these things to move. They're just moving. So as we start to break up, you see it actually separated away from this South America and Africa landmass like over 100 million years ago. So as a result, when you think about after the dinosaurs, when a lot of these major mammals started arising, the zebras, the horses, the felines, et cetera, these things didn't even exist by the time Madagascar split away from Africa, maybe in a very rudimentary form, but not like the forms we see today. So it's actually quite a bit more closely related to India as it goes like faunistically and floristically. Also very close to Antarctica and Australia, but really the main point is that we went through this whole big shift in the Earth, especially with the flora and fauna around 65 million years ago. Remember, dinosaurs went extinct, things got a whole different shape shifting. So modern day life kind of arose at a very, very different level, 80 million years to present once Madagascar was split off. So that's a lot of time for things to speciate. It's a lot of time for things to develop. So let's just set that aside for a second. Let's talk about the ecosystem. So the other thing that life needs to flourish and to proliferate and to radiate in terms of like genetics and whatnot is a diversity of habitats. So Madagascar, like a lot of highly productive places in the world, has a wide diversity of habitats. It's not just dry savanna. It's not just deciduous forest like we have a lot in the US, savanna in Africa. It's not just cloud forest like we see a lot in South America, and lowland rainforest like we see a lot in Indonesia and India and Borneo, et cetera, et cetera. It's a mix of all this. And again, it's all the ingredients you need to bake this amazing evolutionary cake for things to get really weird and wacky and beautiful. So why do we have these climates? Well, basically what we have, because of various things like the Coriolis effect and the spinning of the Earth, we have pretty specific wind patterns and currents and whatnot going through Madagascar. The predominant current and the predominant wind flow pattern is from the east across to the west. Didn't always used to be that way, but for now it is. And so what's happening is we have what's known as, stay with me, a lot of fancy terms I'm throwing out here, but orographic rain patterns. Fancy way of saying that basically mountains affect rainfall. What happens is as rain and moisture, as warm, humid air over the oceans get pushed, this is kind of backwards. Imagine this is the east on the left side, getting pushed up on a big ridge in the middle of Madagascar. You can see here, here's a high point, big mountain range going north to south. It goes up and up and up. It goes up like a skateboard ramp all the way up into the upper atmosphere. Air cools down at a rate of about 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit for every 1,000 feet it climbs. And so what happens is that warm, humid air starts to cool off. And we all know what happens when you cool off a gas. It turns into liquid and it rains. And so what happens is it rains on the side of the mountains where the wind is coming from. So this whole side is super, super duper rainy. The clouds go up, they start to cool down, very big cloud forest ecosystem in the middle. On the western side, as you can see back from this photo, because all the rain has left that air, those clouds move over and it's warm, dry air and it dries out the environment. So the whole western side is really, really dry, spiny forest. And this is all within one relatively small island. It takes us a long time to get from north to south, but animals can do it if they want to pretty easily, again, throughout many, many millions of years. So as a result, we get this wonderful speciation. We don't see any of these things because these all evolved after. But we do see sometime probably around 50 million years ago, some ancestral lemur floated over across the Mozambique Channel, landed on Madagascar, started doing pretty darn well, made a living for him or herself, and speciated from essentially one ancestor into 107 different recognized species today. Pretty fantastic. And this same story goes for the chameleons, it goes for the frogs, it goes for the leaf-tailed geckos, et cetera, et cetera. So remember, think back to, if you know anything about Galapagos Islands, very similar thing, these vegetation rafts that are being blown off the coast of Africa. It's got some little weird ancestral monkey on it living in a tree, big chunk of land falls off a cliff and floats out in the ocean, hits Madagascar. That weird ancestral monkey goes to Madagascar and has a lot of time, dozens of millions of years, to turn into something different as the climate changes, as ecosystems change, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really cool stuff. I could go on for quite a long time, but really what I want to get into is kind of this virtual exploration of Madagascar, exploring each of those 4 ecosystems and all the wondrous life that each contains. Not all the wondrous life, we'd have like 5 more hours of presentation, but my favorite parts of life. Okay, so generally when we have expeditions, we're starting kind of in the dead middle of the country. Antananarivo, first tongue twister of the day, is the capital city. It's affectionately known as Tana for short, so T-A-N-A. It's really the only major international airport. Inbound flights from Africa, from Europe. Remember, it was a French colony, so direct flights from Charles de Gaulle. And that's always our base of operations to start an expedition. And then what we want to do is we want to hit these 4 ecosystems. Now, this chart is not real specific with these ecosystems because this is more of an elevation chart. It is correlated, but nevertheless, we're looking at rainforest over here. You can probably see my mouse circling on the right. We're looking at cloud forest down in the central region south of Tana, spiny desert southwest of there, lower elevation, and then deciduous forest all along this coast. We're going to end there. We have 4 stops in this virtual journey. And not only is this a beautiful deciduous forest, you're going to see those baobabs, but it's also some of the most pristine, beautiful beaches in the Indian Ocean. A great, great bonus. So I want to show a little bit of the landscape. So like I said, we do a combination when we're on our expeditions of like driving and flying. I love driving in the country. It's a really interesting glimpse of the landscape. It is a very rudimentary landscape. It is relatively, I hesitate to use the word primitive. I don't think that's appropriate necessarily, but it is a bit of a primitive society. You can see these are mud huts with straw roofs. They are very much on subsistence level agriculture. They're in mud fields. They're farming rice largely. Rice is a pretty major thing. So just like we see the biodiversity and the geology as having a bit of India and a bit of Indonesia and a bit of Australia and a bit of Africa all kind of mixed together, the culture and people is the same. You wouldn't think that rice is one of the main staple diets compared to mainland Africa, but it certainly is in India, certainly is in Indonesia. Interesting connection there. So as we're driving through, we're seeing ox carts and we're seeing lots and lots of wildlife once we get to national parks. My favorite species, if you will, of the lowland tropical rainforest is the largest lemur in the world. Not always the largest living lemur. Believe it or not, there were lemurs that were the size of gorillas back about 2,000 to 5,000 plus years ago, maybe a little bit more. But nevertheless, nowadays, the largest living lemur is known as the Indri. That's what this guy is, kind of looks like a teddy bear, also known as the teddy bear lemur. It is arboreal, it hangs out in trees. If it means anything to you, it's a member of that Sifica family. You saw that chart, so it's related to a couple of other critters I'm about to show you here in a second. And it's huge. It's about 3 to 4 feet. It's the size of a small child, and it's really, really eerie to see these guys in trees because they're so human-like. And I think largely that's attributed to how they position themselves and posture themselves in the trees. You can see kind of up and down, vertical, just hanging out right there. Not like some of the old New World monkeys where they're a little bit more like cat-like, raccoon-like on all fours. They're just like a person sitting in the tree, and they have the most eerie call. I was going to try to put it as an audio clip in this presentation, but I thought you might laugh more if I repeat the call myself. And this is serious. So each morning, the fog is rolling in and out of these massive, massive trees in the distance. You know, we're waking from the lodge, and the first thing you hear just before the sun comes up is this weird foghorn-like call. And you say, what in the world is that? Is it some massive insect right outside my room? What is it going on? And from a distance, you hear these guys calling from their family troop to family troop, and it really does. It sounds like this. It's I'm not gonna do too much because I'm gonna wake my dog up and they'll start barking. But it's really, really eerie, really cool, and it's from these guys. And especially as we're hiking and trekking through the forest, we can listen for these calls to get closer and closer, and it's absolutely fantastic. So another species in this lowland rainforest that is of notable concern, but also of beauty, is the diadem Sifica. The reason I say concern, and we'll talk about this in a little bit of a conservation section at the end of this talk, but lemurs, because they're not found anywhere else in the world, and Madagascar does have some conservation challenges, they are endangered, as all lemurs are. And these guys are heavily researched and tracked. In fact, I think in one of these slides, you're going to see a little radio collar that I'll wear. This is purely in the wild, but the diadem Sifica, many people believe this would be the most beautiful lemur on the island. And we'll trek, we'll see these, we'll hike. They're absolutely exquisite. And again, because they have no real natural fear of humans, they're not skedaddling at the first moment we put eyes on them or the first camera click. They're just sitting there, they're eating fruit or leaves or whatever they're after for the day. And similar species do the same thing. It's absolutely extraordinary. So I think that it's not just the diversity and beauty of the life forms or the scenery. It's the fact that you can really get close. You can study these guys. You can look at them. You can photograph them. You can showcase and tell better stories because of how you are able to more or less interact with the various lemurs. So we just saw there one of the bamboo lemurs. We've got the common brown lemur, that there are like 7 different subspecies, slightly different looks. And you can see the quality of this photo, how close I'm able to get to these guys. And they are just entirely indifferent. It's absolutely extraordinary. As we're in the lowland rainforest, the bird life is spectacular too. And I have to give credit to the shot to one of my trackers and local guides. These are collared nightjars, and this is actually 2 different birds. You see here one looking right at me, right, its left eye and then its right eye, and another one with its beak just kind of in this direction right here. And these are 2, a man and wife, a boy and a girl, male and female, kind of huddled together very, very low to the ground. And I'm a guide. I am a wildlife enthusiast and naturalist. I'm used to looking for animals big and small all the time. And I walked right by these guys, and my tracker guide just said, hey, look right over there. This is probably one of the most sought after species of bird life in the entire island. And they were able to pick this out from just perfect camouflage in a dimly lit rainforest. When we're in this highly productive rainforest, this is where the reptiles flourish. This is the world's largest chameleon, known as a Parsons Chameleon. Frankly, from the tip of its nose to its tail, it actually goes out of this frame. Like my hands, it's about 3 feet long. It's pretty extraordinary. You can see the colors and, again, the demeanor. They are partially camouflaged, so they don't really care if you're looking at them. But once again, because there aren't a ton of major predators, these guys have to worry a little bit more of some of the raptors, some of the birds, but nevertheless, they're pretty sedentary and they're pretty okay with us looking and photographing them. So in the same area, we're going to zoom all the way to the world's smallest chameleon. This is known as the Brookesia Chameleon. And you can see this is a normal lens cap. It's about the size of my pinky nail, maybe slightly bigger, like my pinky knuckle. Simply extraordinary. And so we're looking for these guys. We're seeing them. We're learning about them. It's a really, really awesome part. And again, this is just east of that capital city. It looks brown on this map because this is an elevation map, but it is this rainforest setting. So we're going to continue the virtual journey as we go back through the capital and go down south. Now we're getting into the cloud forest. On the way, we are passing more of this extraordinary kind of medieval landscape. A lot of places in Africa and this region of the world will have bomas or more rounded houses, or they might have stick houses with thatched roofs. But because the clay, we're going to talk about clay in a conservation aspect here, the clay is so high quality, and it's actually a byproduct of this rice farming. They have these extraordinary little villages that they're basically stone houses, and they're really, really cool. And this is all from this Malagasy clay. One of the things that they do each year is they will plow the soil to plant the rice crop. They do 2 rice crops a year. In the meantime, what they'll do is they'll collect some of that mud and they'll make bricks. One of the most fascinating things is to be zooming through the countryside on the relatively nice roads, and we'll see these huge piles of bricks being baked in sort of self-contained little ovens on the side of the road, and they will sell these for people to make homes as they reside near these various rice paddies. It's pretty fascinating. So as we get to the cloud forest, it's one of the most photogenic landscapes, I think, of the country. This is Rhonda Mafana. It was set aside in around the year 1990 because of this guy right here, the golden bamboo lemur. This is a very highly endangered lemur. It's coming back quite nicely, but nevertheless, it was thought to have been extinct. And then Dr. Patricia Wright, who you'll see a photo of here in a second, in collaboration with Duke University, had actually discovered this as part of, I believe it was one of her grad school projects or maybe postdoc projects, discovered this lemur. It actually existed. She brought it back from the dead and has conserved it in an amazing way. And it's a beautiful, beautiful lemur species here, but it's not the only one. We got a lot of other species in the area, like this one that I showed you on the very first title slide, the Milne-Edwards Sifica. Remember, if you're kind of correlating the names here, the Sificas often are these more human-like positions and postures. You see how they kind of orient themselves on branches from top to bottom. I think they're some of the most extraordinary lemurs to see and photograph because of how human-like they are, and their mannerisms and their long fingers and their expressions, these big wide eyes and looking around. They're pretty amazing. And this is the landscape that we have to look for them in. It's pretty remarkable. As we get into this high altitude or higher altitude cloud forest, we're starting to get really, really cool proliferation of insects. And you may not be an insect person, but if you go to Madagascar, you will become one. They're absolutely amazing. This is the world's largest moth. There's a lot of ways to measure largest, but the largest in terms of circumference, if you were to draw a circle around it, it truly, once again, is about the size of my screen here. It's got massively long tails. If you have ever seen a Luna moth, if you're back out east, Luna moth, one of the silk moths, very close relative, but again, comet moth only found in Madagascar, and you can see how beautiful it is. Massive, massive species. Usually we find these right outside our lodge, which is pretty fun. And you can see as you get closer and closer, the ability for macro photography is extraordinary. But the cool thing I want to tell you about this guy is what the local communities are able to do with the comet moth. So the comet moth is a member of the silk moth family, the Saturnids, and this is the cocoon on the left. So what happens is all silk moths will build this silken cocoon around their pupal case. So this is really just kind of like a little bit of a shell. They'll build this around the pupal case and then actually pupate inside, emerge as an adult, and leave this behind, really just as refuse. So what the local folks have figured out doing, now, frankly, the Chinese have figured out how to do this many, many thousands of years before this, but if you take these cocoons and you soak them in water for a couple days, and very carefully you can begin to unravel them, they turn truly into silk. And you can make these beautiful silk scarves with natural dyes like indigo and saffron and all sorts of stuff, and sell them to local folks, sell them to people in the cities, and sell them to ecotourists like ourselves. And I'm very proud to say I have a couple Malagasy silk moth scarves right here to show off. Some of my most prized possessions from the beautiful, beautiful moth. Doesn't affect the moth at all. They don't reuse these cases whatsoever. But you can see how neat they are. They're a little bit rougher than a normal kind of farmed Chinese silk moth, but nevertheless, one of the coolest things to pick up in the country. And it's very natural. It's organic, if you wish to call it that, and it's a great way to support local communities. The other cool moth I want to talk about before we move on from this cloud forest is, if you've ever seen or heard of the Darwin's Sphinx moth, this is it. So really interesting thing. What happened is About 20 years before Darwin's death, he was presented this massive orchid right here in his laboratory, in his collection from another botanist friend. And he noticed that there's this massive pollen tube right here, this pollen spur, this nectiferous spur. And what he observed to do is it actually held all the nectar of the plant. Now you might actually see, I think impatiens, actually a very common ornamental here in the US, has this long nectiferous spur. These guys have the same thing, but he said, golly, look how long this thing is. There's no way this is pollinated by anything but a Sphinx moth with a really, really long tongue, or proboscis. He never saw the Sphinx moth. The first of its kind was actually discovered in the same year of his death. I don't know if he actually ever heard of the moth being found, but he had this hypothesis of Darwin's Sphinx moth. Lo and behold, the moth was discovered. It has this massively long tongue, and this orchid is found in the region, as is the moth. So really cool how it's all connected. Next time you're watching a David Attenborough documentary and he mentions pollination by moths or the Darwin Sphinx moth, this is it, only found in Madagascar. So a couple other really fascinating critters we're seeing in the highlands of Madagascar in this cloud forest. Tenrecs. Tenrecs as a group are found elsewhere in the world, but there's a couple species found nowhere else in the world, only in Madagascar. They're like small little hedgehogs, porcupines. They're about the size of a hamster, to be honest. And they'll bop through the forest and they'll kind of display, and they'll bop their head up like this. Of course, very spiny thorns in case any sort of birds want to get after it. These guys do have some natural fear because they're much smaller than the bigger lemurs and bigger chameleons, but nevertheless, really, really interesting critter that we might find, in addition to some of the smallest species of lemurs out there. So we talked about the biggest in the rainforest just a second ago at 3 or 4 feet tall. We have the entire mouse lemur group, which again is about the size of a hamster, very, very prolific in the Rhonda Mafana cloud forest area. Geckos proliferate as well. This is one of the most interesting, or at least the most interesting name. Believe it or not, this is truly named the Satanic leaf-tailed gecko. You can see here, I think because of the little protrusions above its eyes, it's kind of a little bit devilish looking. It's not bad. It doesn't do anything bad to you. It's very, very harmless, highly photogenic. And then before we move on and go to the spiny deserts, I want to talk about these little guys. So the Giraffe-Necked Weevils of Madagascar, they are absolutely beautiful. One of my most favorite insects in the world. These are males, and the reason I can tell is they have the long neck. So this is where they get their giraffe name. The neck is actually about 3 times as long as the body. And what they'll do is they'll actually fight with one another and kind of posture to throw one another off the leaf in search of these females, which you can't quite tell because the foreground's a little bit blurry in this photo to make way for this guy in sharp focus. But the female has a little bit shorter of a neck. The male uses a long neck to actually make a gift for the female, believe it or not. We call that a nuptial gift. And he rolls a little, frankly, like a cigar out of the leaves he's on, with that neck, using it as like this rolling appendage, and he will carry it and present this rolled leaf to the female, in which she must lay her eggs. The female has to lay her eggs in these rolled leaves, otherwise they don't survive, they dry out, they're eaten by parasites and parasitoids and other predators. So this is an amazing way life has evolved, where the male has figured out this way to court the female, so to speak, give this rolled leaf as this nuptial gift, and she now knows to lay her eggs, and their offspring survive and continue the species. Pretty cool stuff. Before we go on, we got a couple of photos. I wanted to show the bamboo lemurs, the golden bamboo lemurs in action. They're voracious. You don't want to be a stick of bamboo around these guys. They go after it, but they're really quite cute. And once again, really, I hope she likes this title, the Jane Goodall of lemurs, really. Dr. Patricia Wright here showing us a little bit about her research project at the Center of Val Bio. Extraordinary person. The research station is situated right in the heart of the Rhonda Mafana forest. I love to bring my guests there when we're on expedition. It's really cool to see what a working field laboratory looks like. And of course, their back patio doesn't have the worst views necessarily. Okay, so as we move on, we're now going down south to the desert southwest. So often in these expeditions, there's a marked line in the sand where we're leaving that sort of green, humid rainforest, cloud forest behind. We're getting into the drier forests going forward. Remember that margin is right around here, and we're heading into Isalu. And you notice that the landscape changes markedly. I mean, it really does. You have these massive sandstone and granite domes. You have a drier landscape. You have very open fields. You have palm trees. It's like you just stepped into the Middle East or something. It's really interesting how it goes. And actually, frankly, more than that, because of the massive rock formations, it looks kind of like you're in the southwest of the US. And it does, believe it or not, actually share a lot of the same geologic qualities of this, we call it Jurassic sandstone. In fact, it's very similar in quality, in category, to the sandstone of Zion National Park here in the US. So amazing landscape, couldn't be more different. It's one of the coolest drives to go down from the south, or from the cloud forest down to the southwest, kind of gradually get out of this humid zone and into the dry southwest deserts and be seeing an entirely different landscape. Even though it's dry, it's seemingly somewhat inhospitable, it does still harbor extraordinary life. It has oases in it, amazing hiking, and this is the land of the ringtail lemur, the most famous lemur species of all. It's a much drier lemur, drier species, or where it lives is much drier. They are adapted to live on the ground and in the trees. You can see here, we actually shift from those Sifica lemurs that are kind of upright in the trees, hanging on kind of like a human would or a child would from a branch. These guys are more cat-like, and a lot of the lemurs we're going to be seeing going forward are that way. They've adapted to their surroundings. They've had millions of years to adapt to the spiny forest, the dryness. Their finger pads are much tougher to grip on, to cactus thorns. It's amazing how these guys can move around. And their babies may be the cutest lemur babies on the entire island. So we'll just put this here for your viewing pleasure. Like I said, we're getting different species of common brown lemurs, or different subspecies. And we are also seeing one of my favorite lemurs on the island. This is another Sifica. There's a correlation there. I love the Sificas. This is known as Verreaux's Sifica, and these are those lemurs that do that amazing dance. So this is often on the cover of guidebooks. If you ever see Madagascar featured in like a Planet Earth or Our Planet, they're often showcasing the Verreaux's Sifica as they do this amazing choreographed dance along the soil, along the terra firma, so to speak. And during the breeding season, the little lemur babies hitch a ride with mom, and it's just pretty darn cute. It's a good reason to be there. It's amazing. They kind of have this kind of like kung fu thing that they do with other males. They're very gentle, but they're very animated. It's pretty extraordinary. So I love the Southwest as much as I love the biodiversity and the insects and all the weird and wacky stuff, the chameleons and whatnot of the rainforest and cloud forest. To me, it's almost like the spiny desert of the Southwest of Madagascar really is the true nature. And once again, you know, just amazing landscapes, amazing sunsets and sunrises. I love deserts personally, so it's really an exquisite area. And once again, this is in the Asalo area, Asalo National Park. Another reason I love it is I love trees and I love baobabs. So baobabs is another one of those species that we don't see a lot of in mainland Africa, but we see extraordinary diversity in Madagascar. And actually, while there's only one species of baobab tree on the continent of Africa, there's 6 or 7 different species of baobabs just in Madagascar, and they're actually quite different shapes and sizes and forms. Often termed the upside down tree because they kind of look like a tree was just uprooted, turned upside down, and its roots are in the air, like as you can see with this photo. It's pretty wild. The stuff that lives on and around baobabs, equally adapted. You have this massive tubular root sticking out of the ground. Great substrate for things like Phelsumous day geckos to hang around. Extraordinarily colorful grasshoppers and locusts. You may not be a big locust person, I happen to be. Nevertheless, it's really cool photographic fodder when you're there. And also keep in mind, you know, this is such a hotbed for geologic activity. And again, I think I mentioned this a few times now, but these dinosaur fossils, sometimes I like to take my guests into one of the fossil markets in Antananarivo, and you can see these massive ancestral ammonite fossils. It's kind of like a nautilus shell. You'll often see these if you go to, you know, kind of like big resort areas. If you go to Vegas or Aspen or something like that, they'll usually have these natural wonder fossil shops. A lot of that stuff, you'll start looking to see the descriptions, where it was found, Madagascar, Madagascar, Madagascar. And sometimes we can even pick some up in these fossil markets at quite a bit of a deal. Okay, so we just toured through 3/4 of the expedition itinerary. We looked at the lowland forest and the rainforest, the cloud forest, spiny desert, and now we're heading to, you know, I say that these other areas are some of my favorite, but the deciduous forest and beaches of Madagascar, it's hard not to put this as one of the most beautiful, spectacular parts of the island. After all, we're in warm, coral reef prolific Indian Ocean. So you know the beaches are going to be pretty. Before I do that, I do want to talk about the elephant in the room, so to speak, which is that Madagascar is definitely in peril. It's something that you can't ignore. When you're there, you do see it. As we were in charter planes bopping around from place to place, you notice that civilization has sprawled. They are subsistence agricultural based. They farm for themselves. They farm to put food on their table, and they indeed have taken a lot of the trees out of the landscape. And what that does is it has led over the last, frankly, 2,000 years since humans first landed on the island about 2,000 years ago, to pretty severe erosion. Okay, and so this is probably one of the big conservation issues. If you do Google it, if you watch nature shows on it, is that as the trees are taken out for building materials, a lot was actually done, again, like thousands of years ago. We can't blame necessarily the last couple centuries for it of sort of European imperialism. It was definitely more towards like the 5 to 1,000 year ago time period. Wood for building ships. A lot of the Arab traders coming down the east coast of Africa made it down to Madagascar, tanked up on all sorts of fresh food and fresh timber. And so the landscape has been steadily and largely denuded for really hundreds of years. When those roots are no longer in the soil over hundreds of years of normal periodic rains, that soil just kind of melts away into the rivers. And what we get is this landscape in this area where all that rich clay, like I mentioned, that is so integral to not just building homes via bricks, but also is integral to the health and integrity of the ecosystem. Soils are rightfully so being a big topic of conversation in terms of conservation today. And unfortunately, Madagascar's land is quite literally melting away underneath it. So it's all the more reason why we need to invest in Madagascar from an ecotourism standpoint and from a conservation standpoint. I'm so proud to be with both these organizations because we're making huge leaps and bounds to reforest the island. In fact, since 2003, the number of protected areas in Madagascar has tripled, which is a really, really good number. So things can be bad at one hand, but also can be getting better at the same time. And I can tell you that the conservation situation for Madagascar is still a little bit grim, but nevertheless, we're making huge strides in the past couple of decades. So I remain optimistic. So there are natural river deltas as we get out to the coast. This is a normal looking ecosystem. This is normally what it looks like. You get a bit of sedimentation going down in these river deltas, flowing out into the salt water. But nevertheless, as we zoom along the coast in a flight, you can see how beautiful the aerial perspective becomes after we get sort of through that civilized interior part where deforestation has unfortunately happened. As you get into more remote areas on those fringes of the island, things get back to normal and have this pristine, beautiful, positive look. And that's why I truly am positive about the island, is that it's not, the whole thing isn't taking the same course. So nevertheless, we end the last spot of our itinerary. Our expedition here is in the northwest coast at Deciduous Forest, in the resort and also the conservation area known as Anjajavi. And this is where, it's these high-end eco resorts and conservation mix so perfectly, and why ecotourism is so important. Just a decade ago, this whole area was unprotected, or a couple of decades ago, I should say, unprotected. It's sort of a little of the Wild West as to who was coming and going and what was happening to the environment. But Anjajavi Lodge, which is actually one of the only relay, it is the only relay and chateau property in Madagascar, took it upon themselves to save this entire massive ecosystem and really bring it up a level and turn it actually into, with World Wildlife Fund's help, one of the newest national parks as of just a couple of years ago. And it is extraordinary. You can see the beaches are beautiful. I'll tell you, beaches in Madagascar is not the first place I think of when competing with the likes of Fiji and Tahiti and whatnot. But I'll tell you, for remoteness and the uniqueness of it, it is really high on the list, I have to say. So while the beaches are empty, the interior, just where my hand is, just on the other side of these palm trees, teeming with life. And now we're at, I'm going to say this is my favorite lemur. I probably said that 3 or 4 times. This is definitely my favorite lemur. This is another Sifica, cockerel Sifica, very closely related to Varro's, the jumping, the choreographed dancing one. If you compare it side by side, they do look a little bit different with their pattern on their fur, but nevertheless, these are found right around the lodge. This is a natural population. They feed on the natural fruits around there, and gosh, I love these little guys. So cockerel Sifica, my favorite lemur. You can mark my word for it. And you'll see him in Anjajavi, which is fantastic. Now, a new, not so new species of lemur that is actually probably one of the most sought after lemurs on the island is being found around Anjajavi now. It hasn't always been the case. It's the Aye, and that's spelled AYE-AYE. So if you remember back in the beginning of my presentation, I gave you all those 5 families and just long lists of all the species of lemurs underneath. There was one kind of hanging on the right that didn't have much underneath it. It's because this lemur is the only member of its entire family of lemurs, and this is the II. It is a very interesting creature. It kind of goes against the grain of what you might think a lemur should look like. I think it's cute. Others think maybe with that long spindly finger, maybe not the cutest lemur, but nevertheless, it's something I've always wanted to see. I got my first chance of seeing these guys actually last year on an expedition in Anjajabi because they're reintroducing them into the wild. They've had a bit of a conservation issue with them in the past. I think because they have been so odd looking for the past couple millennia, people just weren't as sensitive to their needs. Nevertheless, they're an amazing species, and to look for them at night and encounter them, it was a highlight of my biologic expedition career. As we wrap up here, another quick highlight of Anjajabi and the amazing conservation work they do is that it's long been purported that there used to be massive tortoises on the island of Madagascar, just north in the Seychelles, which is more like off the coast of Kenya. The Seychelles is home to one of the only other species of giant tortoises in the world outside of Galapagos. Legend has it, and actually shouldn't say legend, biology has it, that it's possible that the Galapagos giant tortoise was actually from the Seychelles, meaning that tortoise somehow rafted, somehow floated across the earth, probably about 5 million years ago when the Galapagos were finished forming and developing, and colonized Galapagos all the way from the Indian Ocean. So it's an amazing connection between the two areas. Nevertheless, so they have this giant tortoise conservation project. These are not rewilded yet. They are not roaming freely out in the terrain around Anjajabi and the national park. But nevertheless, they have about a dozen individuals of these. They are actively keeping them, breeding them, doing research on them, and they're working with the government in conjunction with the lodge and World Wildlife Fund and others to reintroduce these giant tortoises to their native ground. It's pretty cool stuff, and we can see them when we're there. But at the end of the day, the coasts of Madagascar are it's such a unique kind of ending or even climax of the story to be in this lowland rainforest, this cloud forest, a spiny desert, and to be in this very, very otherworldly, almost like Indiana Jones kind of vibe on the coast. Beautiful villages, amazing people. We're doing a lot of work with the lodge and the community here to prop them up to benefit from ecotourism and conservation travel. So without further ado, we'll just kind of end there. Oh, and before I get to the last slide, I wanted to quickly say, I haven't mentioned the people of Madagascar too much, but like I said, they're some of the most amazing people. They're very resilient. They're very resourceful. It is a very impoverished nation, but knowing many guides and trackers and community members and community leaders, there is so much hope for the country as long as we continue to prop them up. Ecotourism and conservation travel actually happens to be the largest foreign exchange earner for Madagascar. So, what we're doing in partnership with World Wildlife Fund, we're handling the conservation as well as the tourism to get these guys a very, very long heritage. And with that, I want to thank you guys, and I'd love to see what questions you have for me. Thanks so much.
Court. We've got a lot of great questions for you. First, I'd like to remind folks watching that if you have a question for Court, you can submit those in your control panel under the questions field. Okay, first question. Do you know what the origin of the name Madagascar is?
Oh gosh, I don't. I feel like I've heard it. It's almost not. Does that person have an answer, or is it?
No.
No. Oh, I don't know. I'll look it up and I'll get back to you. I really will.
Okay.
I feel like I've heard it. It's not. I don't have it. Great question though.
Stumped ya.
Yeah.
Next question. This might stump you as well. How many miles long is the island?
Ooh, 482. No, I'm kidding. I don't know that either. I will say, so it takes about, let's say, 3 hours to travel about 2/3 of the length, going at about 200 miles an hour. We can probably do the math. Yeah, that would be a very easily Googleable question. That will be easier for me to answer with a little bit of research. But it is, just for what it's worth, it's the 4th largest island in the world. After we've got, let's see, number 1 is Greenland, and then we have New Guinea, and then we have Borneo, and then Madagascar, and then number 5, any guesses, is Baffin Island. So yeah, I don't have that exact number, but it's surprisingly sizable.
Okay. with the lack of fear by the animals of predation, is there a high amount of poaching, and how are the animals being protected right now?
Historically, yes. Yeah, I mean, I think, frankly, so there is a lot of legend in Madagascar. Madagascar culture is very much determined by kind of oral tradition and this concept of fady, F-A-D-Y, which means kind of like taboo. And for a long, long time, the dominant kind of majority tribes of Madagascar believed it to be very fady, very taboo to eat lemur. And so they actually did really, really well for large periods of time. But anytime you're with any sort of people coming from out of the country, especially traders in the last couple thousands of years, you have just general lack of knowledge. You probably had 100 times as many lemurs. There were probably so many, you just open a pillowcase and they jump in. Not a very good image, but nevertheless. And then desperation. So, people that were shipwrecked or marooned on the island, you have people, maybe there was a couple bad years where either rained too much or too little, didn't get enough rice crop. And so, yes, anytime you have that, I mean, that is not a good thing for biology and not a good thing for critters to be so easily approachable. I think, I kind of talk it up as if they have absolutely no fear. They have more predators in the Galapagos than the Galapagos. They have, even baby lemurs can be taken by boas, snakes. They can be taken by some of the large raptors and birds. There are some pretty big birds on the island. It's just that compared to Africa, certainly, and really compared to anywhere, quote unquote, normal, it sits at that low fear level. But nevertheless, they have a little bit of wiliness that they're not going to necessarily let you just like pick them up per se. It's more just that they don't have that tenacity to skedaddle so quickly. As far as conservation goes nowadays, so a lot of the island is deforested. We're looking at big double-digit percentages. Like some estimates say that maybe since it's 100% forestation times, like around 2,000 years ago, probably only 10% of original forest is remaining. Now that sounds terrible, and it is. But because it's such a big island, they've been able to protect these national parks really, really well. So there are pockets of wildlife, there are pockets of biodiversity, pockets of pristine ecosystems. There are a lot of natural corridors between all this. So it's not like civilization has moved in and taken over every patch of land. So the ability to regenerate and connect forests is pretty high. They take ecotourism very, very seriously. They know lemurs are by far the #1 thing people want to come see, and it is absolutely today very foddy to infringe on the national parks at any big scale, and especially to poach lemurs.
Okay, great. We had several people write in some answers to the first 2 questions.
Nice.
So looks like Marco Polo named the island. And the island is 995 miles long and 360 miles wide.
There we go. It's a big island. Yeah, it's pretty sizable. Oh, I'm gonna have to dig into that Marco Polo thing. I'm curious if it means something, or I know I've heard it. I've heard it in the past. I'm sure if I was headed out to go guided, I'd be full of random fun facts like that.
Looks like some people are saying it's the Great Red Island, if that rings any bells.
Ah, yes, I think that's what it is. I think it translates to Great Red Island. Is that what they're saying? I'm sticking with it.
Okay.
Yeah, that's okay. Connecting the thing. Thank you guys. Teamwork. Look at this. It's
I
like
know.
Great.
Yeah, it's fabulous. Okay, moving on to questions about our trips, when we run trips there. What's the best time of year to visit?
Good question. So, because you have different ecosystems, there are going to be parts that are pretty dry year round. So you have a pretty big open window of season. I will say, just to cut to the chase, pretty much any time from late May through November is pretty darn good. It's in the Southern Hemisphere, so that's gonna be technically kind of like their winter, so it's gonna be drier. That being said, when you are, for those first 2 stops, when you are in the rainforest and cloud forest, you've probably heard me say this before, there are 2 seasons to rainforests around the world. There's the rainy season and the rainier season. So you're gonna get rained on. The animals are still gonna, have water to drink. There's gonna be fruit blooming or flowers blooming and fruit dropping throughout the year. But if you were to go and say like January or February, it's gonna be pretty darn rainy. I would steer clear of that. But yeah, between say like June and November, it's really good. I will say for those people that are more interested in the smaller amphibians and the reptiles and the insects and the cooler, smaller stuff, you'll do pretty well as you get later into that winter period. So as you get into like the, late August, September, certainly October and November, you start to get an uptick of rain possibly, but that brings some of the smaller critters out in bigger numbers. But again, the whole time, and oftentimes I get questions about, well, when are the baby lemurs around? And I would be asking that too. Because there are 107 different species, they are very asynchronous throughout the year. Because it is a tropical ecosystem, you can have babies of different species really at multiple times. So while you may not see a baby of one species at this time, a couple months later, it'll have a baby, but then at that previous time, it'll be different offspring of different species. So you kind of always have young, impressionable, amazing lemurs around throughout the year.
How strenuous is the hiking on our trips?
It's a good question. So the majority of it is not. When you get into the rainforest and cloud forest, you're talking about a small handful of hikes that could be rated in that trekking scale. I'm not going to put it on par with gorilla trekking because that's a whole different ball of wax, but it is trekking. It is off track travel, like off path walking and hiking, which means that it could be slippery. It could mean that you need to take a hand to climb over a down tree. It could mean that's very slow. It could mean that it's steep up or down. But again, I would say if you know Nat Hab and a lot of our trips, it's not like any sort of exaggerated different category of trips. But for a small handful of hikes, it can get a little bit, like maybe a couple hours of slow hiking out and back to see the lemurs and off-trail stuff and little things like that. You can bring trekking poles; they help sometimes. So it's a little bit on the more active end, but then a lot of the times, like when we're in a solo, a lot of the times when we're in Untitled, it's not high physicality. It's relatively flat, easy walking.
And so what are the chances of seeing all the fauna you've shown during this presentation, and what part of the island are we going to see the most lemurs?
Yeah, so that's what I love saying this, like pretty darn high. I bet you, so let me be honest here. I bet you see everything that I showed. Maybe not the tenrec. The tenrec is sort of seasonal. They're a little bit more of a wet season species. The ii has historically been impossible to see. It's only the last couple of years that we're seeing them more around Anjajavi, but there's an honest chance. And the cool thing is we actually know it because there are trackers that are out there researching it, and they'll be like, oh yeah, she's in nest 23. She's very easily accessible. It's just a quick walk down the path. You wait there for a little bit. Or she's like, oh, she's in nest 11. Yeah, good luck. No, it's not gonna happen, So we know it. Pretty darn good chance. It's pretty amazing.
Awesome. Just a few more questions. What is the difference between a rainforest and a cloud forest?
Oh yeah, good question. It's so technically, like if I were to really get into it, there's like 32 different Holdridge life zones, and it's like this big triangle and like this big matrix, and like there's small differences. So there's actually a difference between what's known as a lowland montane rainforest and a mid-montane upper cloud forest and all this stuff. Don't take it too seriously. They're pretty similar. In general, a rainforest is not as habitually misty and cloudy, and it's at a lower elevation. Usually cloud forest is higher elevation. Madagascar is one of those weird cases where its rainforest and cloud forest is actually at a pretty similar elevation, between 4,000 and 5,000 feet elevation. It has to do with like, is it a persistent habitual mist because of the geography, because of the microclimate, the elevation, et cetera, et cetera. But really, the big factor is how much rain does it get a year, like literally just taking a rain meter. It has to do with elevation a lot, what part of the slope it's at, what ocean is it on. So you'll notice like Costa Rica is a great example. They kind of pioneered this whole terminology. They have like 12 different Holdridge life zones ranging from lowland cloud forest to lowland rainforest. It's just, the list goes on and on. It's like if you've ever seen a soil chart, I'm getting kind of nerdy here, but yeah, if you guys it sounds like a few people are on Google, check out like, the soil triangle, like the mixture of clay, silt, and sand. There's like 64 different types of soil based on those primary colors, so to speak. I guess the primary colors of rainforest and cloud forest are precipitation, elevation, and proximity to water.
Cool.
I'm way oversimplifying though.
That's okay. So there's a couple questions. They just wanted you to repeat the names of a couple different species you mentioned. The first one was that little hedgehog-like creature, and the other one was the smallest chameleon.
Yeah, so the hedgehog is a tenrec, Tenrec, tenrec. And there are two species that are often found, the highland streaked and the lowland streaked like a streaking going like pattern. Yeah, tenrec, they're amazing. And then what was the other? Oh, the Brookesia. So Brookesia, Brookesia, Brookesia. And that's the genus of that chameleon. But it's also like a lot of these things aren't named with common names, so we just call it Brookesia.
Cool. Okay, I'm gonna wrap it up with a couple camera questions for you. I'm gonna combine them all into one. People just are curious about what lenses you use, specifically when you're photographing lemurs and when you're using macro photography, and how do you protect your camera in the rainforest?
Great question. So, because there's a lot of hiking involved, I want to be relatively streamlined and minimal on the diversity of lens I would take. I'm bringing my typical walking around lens, like a 24-105 or an 18-55, depending on full frame versus crop frame. And then I'm using my good old 100-400. You could bring a 70-200. In fact, if you have that, and you can, with the luggage allotments and all that, and you can bring it, it can be helpful. But I find that having the range of 400, even though you may not need it because sometimes they are closer, it allows you to fill the frame more with the lemur's face. It allows more versatility. Maybe you're seeing a bird over here and a lemur over here. You can get both of the same lens and not worry about changing it. So really, I don't bring a whole lot, but I do bring a dedicated macro setup. There are only a handful of places in the world that bring a dedicated macro setup with my dedicated lens. I have a flash for it. I have like accessories and all that. It's Madagascar, Borneo, tropical rainforest. Madagascar is great for it. And then protection, I think the biggest thing is just having a backpack that has a rain cover to it. They're making backpacks nowadays that are actually waterproof. Patagonia's got some great ones. There's another one called Sea Line, SEA, like an ocean sea line, and they have like the cinched down kind of like river bag look to it. It's like very thick material. If it starts pouring rain, just put your camera away and you're good to go. And then once the rain stops, like it always does within a few minutes or an hour or so, you bring it back out and you photograph. It's not too often that I'm photographing during the downpour. I have, and fortunately, a lot of the bigger, better cameras nowadays are weather sealed. And I'll be the first just to be honest, like I've got a pretty darn expensive setup, but if I'm getting photos of a lifetime, it's like, whatever, I'm gonna trust the weather seal. And I've been photographing for like hours in the downpour in Madagascar before. This is when I would go during the rainy season for like research and whatnot. And my camera has been okay. And I've got like a Canon weather sealed camera and lens.
Great. All right, well, I'm gonna call it there with questions. We had so many questions today. I apologize if we weren't able to get to your question today. You can give us a call at 800-543-8917 if you'd like to speak to an adventure specialist though. All right, Court, I'm gonna hand it back over to you for closing comments.
Cool, well, thanks so much. Guys, thanks for hanging in there and joining today. As you can tell, Madagascar is a wonderland. It's a paradise. It's got a great backstory from the thousands of years to the hundreds of millions of years. It's unlike any other place on Earth. I mean, it's in my top. If you haven't been there yet, make sure you put that on the list. I would love to see you out in the field. In the meantime, keep dreaming of it. Spread the word about Madagascar. It needs our help, and we want to see it and save it and enjoy all that it's to offer. So thanks so much, guys.
Thanks, Court. Pleasure as always. And my thanks as well to everyone who tuned in today. Be sure to join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. We did record today's presentation, so we'll have the replay available on our website soon. And with that, I'll conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.